You guys have asked for it, and we are delivering it. This is our very first value-oriented system build guide and our very first AMD build guide. So we're going to be going through the usual stuff. So that is best practices when choosing your components, best practices when building your system, and of course, because we're going with an APU from AMD, we're going to explain some of the benefits of an APU versus a more traditional CPU. As always, our configuration starts at the heart with the CPU. Actually, this is an APU. So a traditional CPU has general processing cores built into it that communicate with your system memory and do most of the things that your PC needs to do. Now, over time, this has begun to change. And what an APU does is it integrates Radeon graphics cores and what AMD is really calling DirectX 11 discrete grade graphics into what would normally be a traditional CPU. So in addition to the 4 traditional CPU cores in here, we've got a bunch of Radeon cores that are great for running games and for other applications as well. So for example, rather than just being good for games, integrated graphics can now be used to accelerate OpenCL compatible applications and in the transition towards HSA or heterogeneous system architecture, which is a way of saying that all of the processors are not going to be differentiated the same way that they used to. So, okay, well, this is a CPU and this does this, and this is a GPU and this does that. Instead, they'll be able to work together to reach a goal at the same time rather than, say for example, waiting around for each other to do work until it becomes their turn to work on the same task. It's going to amount to better performance for your system overall, although it was a little bit complicated to get the whole thing going because we needed hardware support and software support, and it's all got to kind of happen at the same time. Now for our system, we chose the A106790K, which is a new model. We chose this because of its great balance between price and performance and the fact that it includes very powerful Radeon graphics. So lower end APUs will tend to have less powerful graphics in addition to less powerful CPU cores. So for some of the OpenCL demos that we're going to show you, this is going to be quite important. For your APU system, you may find some other very interesting choices with either lower prices or even better performance than this one, so don't feel like this is the only option. It's just what we went with to demo this platform. For memory, our usual considerations pretty much come down to, well, the size, how much RAM we need, and then how many channels we need it to run in, whether it's dual, triple, or quad channel. However, for an APU, there are some special considerations. Speed becomes much more important because graphics cores, that is the Radeon cores built into the APU, require higher bandwidth for optimal performance than traditional CPU cores do. So we went with 8 gigs of AMD's Radeon series memory in a dual channel configuration for our value optimized config, but another option if we were willing to sacrifice some performance, particularly in gaming and OpenCL applications now for better upgradability in the future, would be to get a single 8 gig stick and then throw another 8 gig stick in later on down the line and run it in dual channel then, because our motherboard only has 2 slots. Now, why did we go with AMD memory? Frankly, there is no difference in terms of performance between AMD memory and some other memory that's running at pretty much the same speed and timings. The key difference here is compatibility. Because AMD is the one building the memory controller that's on the chip itself, and they're the ones validating the memory for it, you know that it's going to work. With that said, there are many other reliable memory brands out there, and if you buy something from, Kingston or Corsair or whoever else, there's a very, very slim chance that it's not going to work. It's just what you're comfortable with. They have several series of memory, including their entertainment, performance, and gamer series modules, and you can find a capacity and speed that's going to work for you pretty much regardless of your needs and your budget. We went with a very value-oriented option for our motherboard in order to demonstrate the potential cost effectiveness of an APU-based system. With some of the lower cost APUs and a motherboard like this, if you don't need or want much in the way of expansion and you just want performance for your dollar, it's pretty hard to beat it. I mean, this one right here, this is the FM2A55M DGSR 2.0 from ASRock, doesn't have many frills. It doesn't even have USB 3, for example, but it only costs about $50. You can take small steps up in terms of features and robustness. You can add USB 3 here and better audio there, all the way to fully featured gaming grade boards like this one, But I guess the point of all this is that the choice is up to you. So this is a G1 Sniper A88X. It's a fully overclocking ready, gaming ready, crossfire supporting motherboard on the FM2 Plus socket, which is going to have support for upcoming Kaveri APUs. And so everything in between this and this totally exists. So let's be clear about the power supply and case choices we made here. There are much less expensive options. You can spend about a third of what we did on a case that has a bundled power supply that will fit all this stuff, and it'll probably work just fine, at least in the short term. It's just that that's not necessarily the only way to go about it. So we wanted to show off what you can get in terms of a case with great ventilation, great compactness, and very reasonable build quality for about 40 bucks with the Fractal Design Core 1000, but ultimately the choice will be up to you. With a value-oriented build, a lot of the time the difference between 20 bucks and 40 bucks is a lot. So it'll come down to whether you're going to be doing any upgrading in the future and you want that expandability, whether it's worth the additional investment. As for the standalone power supply versus using the bundled power supply that might come with a case, we never recommend using that bundled power supply. Even if it came with your case, throw it away and get a real power supply. You never know what's inside them, and just because it says 400 watts on the outside doesn't mean that it's actually capable of outputting 400 watts. Only use bundled power supplies if they're from a reputable brand like Antec, for example. For our PSU, we went with a Seasonic 400 watt OEM unit. Seasonic is great. They build quiet, reliable power supplies and are often available for less than other brands. This one right here has nothing special about it on the outside, with non-sleeved cables and like an ugly metal housing, but it's like the Millennium Falcon. It's got it where it counts. Nice quiet 120 millimeter fan, nice solid weight to it, which is usually a good sign for a power supply because it means there's actual components inside versus it just being a metal box. And of course, 80 plus bronze efficiency is still something we care about because it can be an indicator of the quality of the components inside. Storage is always a tricky one for us to talk about, and there are a couple of options here. So for 60 bucks, you can get a WD Blue 1 terabyte drive, which has mediocre performance and decent capacity. It's 1 terabyte, but you could also spend a bit more and get something else. So you could either get a WD Black 1 terabyte, which will give you better performance and still good capacity, or you can get a Kingston V300 120 gig SSD if you don't mind planning for a quick upgrade to your storage, because that will give you lightning fast performance, but only 120 gigs of storage, which isn't going to be enough for, massive video collections or a bunch of games or anything like that. So we opted for the Blue drive just because we wanted this to be a pretty inexpensive rig, but I wanted to talk about those other options as well. Talking about graphics with a computer like this is another tough one because we set out to build a good all-round performer and to do an APU build guide here. And because an APU has decent onboard graphics, there's no compelling reason to add a dedicated graphics card unless we were serious about gaming. Now, if we were serious about gaming, there are some fantastic options out there in terms of graphics. So for example, we've got the R7 260X that is fully supported by our motherboard, by our power supply, and by our case. Thank goodness for custom rigs, right? The actual ability to be able to upgrade them is awesome. And adding something like this will take our gaming experience to the next level. There are, however, a couple of reasons I can think of to go with an APU out of the gate, even if you do intend to upgrade to a graphics card later. Because remember, guys, there are AMD CPUs on the FMX platform that are a little bit less expensive. So if you were to put a graphics card right in, then you might not want to do that. Okay, so number one reason is maybe you're not sure how much you're going to game. The APU, this one right here, will handle Battlefield 4 at 720p with medium details. So at least this gives you the opportunity to play it and make a decision later on down the road about whether or not you want to have a graphics card. And it is less expensive to go for an APU versus a CPU than it is to just buy the graphics card outright. Number two is maybe you just plain old don't have the budget right now. With an APU, you can get the system up and running and decide later. So that's tied in very closely to reason number one. Reason number three is maybe the gaming aspect of the PC just isn't even for you. You can still benefit from the APU from a compute perspective, more on that later, and the system will at least be capable of having a little bit of oomph when, the grandkids come to stay for the weekend and they bring a couple of their games with them, for example. The last thing you want is a situation where it just flat out doesn't run. The APU is not going to give you nearly the gaming experience as a dedicated graphics card like this, but at least it brings the system to within gaming capability range without costing a whole lot more. On to our peripherals choices. We went with the H236L BID for our monitor and the MK120 for our keyboard and mouse. I mean, the Logitech MK120 is nothing special. It's very inexpensive, but a cheap mouse and keyboard we can kind of live with, especially if we're not gaming. And especially when you consider how much more you really need to spend to get a great keyboard and mouse. So we'd be spending probably another 10% of our total budget on something like a K30 from Corsair and an M40 from Corsair, which would deliver a great gaming experience and actually most of the performance of even higher cost solutions than those ones, but just is a little bit more than we're willing to spend if we're not gaming. Now, if you're serious about gaming and you do opt for the GPU upgrade, for example, then maybe you can add something like that later on down the road. For the monitor, though, I really believe that you should purchase a monitor more like a piece of furniture. Everyone benefits from a better monitor. It's less fatiguing on your eyes and things just plain look better. They look like the content creator wanted them to look like. The great thing about monitors is that unlike something like a graphics card where you buy it now and it runs all the games really great and then 2 years down the road it doesn't run anything very well anymore, a monitor performs as well as it does pretty much throughout its lifetime. So if you buy a good monitor, you'll be looking at a good image 5 years from now. And if you buy a lousy monitor, you'll still be looking at a lousy monitor 5 years from now. So we went with an IPS monitor because the experience is so much better. It looks better and it really just doesn't cost that much more when you consider how long you might keep it. But this is a very personal thing. Look at your desk. How long have you had that monitor? If it's more than 3 to 5 years and it's lived through a couple of full system upgrades and you skimped last time, maybe think about getting something a little nicer for yourself this time around. On the other hand, if it doesn't bother you at all, then that's great, but I personally find it very frustrating, particularly with for example, low-end TN panels, when you're in something like an email application even, and the read versus unread messages are difficult to distinguish from each other because you can't tell the difference between pale yellow and white. That drives me crazy, and a better monitor makes that a non-issue. For our OS, Windows 8 is the obvious choice for a machine like this because it actually provides better performance on an APU versus Windows 7. This is getting fairly well documented, and I'm interested to see how things continue to progress in this direction in the future. Well, it's time for the actual building now, so start with a safe, static-free workstation, as always, an anti-static strap. I like to keep mine on my ankle to keep it out of the way because I find when it's on my wrist, it just gets caught on things and I'm more likely to make a mistake. And then beyond that, all we really need for assembly is a multi-bit screwdriver. Now, I always recommend building the system outside of the case to ensure that there are no issues with something getting shorted out and to make sure that everything is already working before it's all jammed into a case and it's difficult to swap things in and out and troubleshoot it. The motherboard box makes for a very handy non-conductive test bench. However, this is a very, very common mistake. Don't use the anti-static bag that's on the outside of your motherboard on top of the box, okay? Once the power is actually applied to the board, some of these bags have conductive outer coatings and can actually short out the board if it's powered on. So guys, just to be very, very, very clear, when the board is not powered on top of static bag, okay. When the board is powered on top of anti-static bag, not optimal. I would rather have it on something like a piece of cardboard like the top of the box. So we're going to start with CPU installation. First, carefully remove the CPU and heatsink from the box. The pins on the CPU are extremely fragile. AMD has the pins on the processor, not in the socket versus their competitor. So we're going to leave the CPU inside the plastic shell while we determine the correct orientation. Next, we're going to lift up the retention arm on the socket, then align the small golden triangle on the corner of the CPU with the small plastic triangle on the corner of the socket. Finally, we're going to place the CPU down onto the socket until it falls in on its own. We don't push the CPU into the socket with any kind of force. Just give it a little wiggle to make sure it's in there okay, and once that's done, you can lower the retention arm and your CPU is installed in the socket. Just a couple things to consider when you're putting the heatsink down on the CPU. Number one is to make sure that the metal clips on either side of the heatsink are positioned correctly to hook over the bracket around the CPU socket. And number two is make sure your fan wire is as close as possible to the CPU fan header that is usually labeled on your motherboard. So first, now that it's in position, is to take the clip that's on the side that does not have a plastic arm on the heatsink and put it over the bracket around the CPU socket. Then turn it around, and this metal clip does have a plastic retention arm, so we're going to go ahead and put the metal clip onto the CPU bracket, then take the arm and turn it pretty much a full 180 degrees. This requires a little bit of force until it locks into place. Finally, guys, take your fan wire, and I recommend twisting it up a little bit here so that the wires don't spread out and get into the way of everything, and then plug that into the fan header, which should be, again, clearly labeled. Now please note, guys, that I recommend better CPU cooling than the box cooler that's included if your objective is to have an extremely silent computer or to run beyond stock speeds by overclocking your processor. Neither of those things are very appropriate with our config here, and a better motherboard would be required in addition to better cooling to make that possible. DDR3 installation is simple, especially in a motherboard that only has 2 slots, so you don't have to worry about which ones are right for dual channel operation or color coding or anything like that. All you do is take the modules and align the notch in the module with the little notch in the socket, open up the clips, position the module in the socket, then push down firmly on both sides. It should be noted, guys, that we're installing Gamer Edition memory from AMD, and we had talked about using more value-optimized memory in this system. Don't worry, the way high-end memory works is it's just rated at being able to operate at a higher speed. What we're going to be doing for our performance numbers later on in the video is turning it down manually to simulate what you'd be able to get with entertainment class modules. Hey, now we're ready to start putting stuff in the case. So first we're going to remove the 2 side panels by using the handy-dandy thumb screws that come included on this case. Then we're going to take those side panels and put them somewhere safe where they're not going to get lost. Speaking of keeping things safe and not losing them, a really handy trick that I use all the time is when you take out a screw, put it back where you got it so that you're not going to lose it. So all those thumb screws can go back into the case once we've taken off the side panels. Just don't get confused when you're trying to put the side panel back on and you're going like, oh, why doesn't it fit back on? Oh, there's a thumb screw in the way. So I've definitely done that before. Next thing, just another sanity check type item, is take your I/O shield and make sure that it matches the motherboard and that it is oriented correctly before you go ahead and install it into the back of the case by aligning it and then firmly pushing in all 4 corners until it is poking through a little bit and sits in place without falling out. So the thing about a power supply with no packaging is that it doesn't have any screws included or anything like that. Don't worry, guys, it doesn't matter. In spite of the fact that the handy-dandy box full of mounting hardware that comes with your case doesn't list power supply screws on the back of it, they are indeed included and they look a little something like this. The next step is to take your power supply and decide on the orientation when you put it into the kit. Oh, wait. Note, because we have a top-mounted power supply in this case, we only have one orientation that it goes in with. You can actually see that there's only one set of screw holes. So the reason for that is that while on a bottom-mounted power supply case, you can decide to pull air away from your graphics card area or to pull air through what is normally a filtered intake on the bottom of the case. With a top-mounted case, if we flip this power supply around, it would have nowhere to draw air from because the top of the case is completely solid. So it's for the safety of the power supply itself that it only has one option. Another handy thing about this orientation is that our cables are now at the back of the chassis, where it's a little bit easier to route them and manage them behind the motherboard tray. So all that's left is to slide it into position and then do up the 4 screws that we pulled out of that unlabeled box, and that's pretty much it. The power supply is in. To install the motherboard in our case, we're going to need the little brass standoffs as well as the little black screws with the tight threads on them that are required to actually secure the motherboard to the standoffs. Now, before you put the standoffs onto the motherboard tray in the case, you're going to want to make sure you're putting them in the right place because there are some options depending on the kind of motherboard you have. So we have a full-length MATX board, but it is narrow, so we only actually require 6 standoffs. All we got to do is hold the motherboard up and we can see which holes the motherboard standoffs need to go into. So once we've determined that, there are a couple of different ways to install them. Number one is if you happen to have one of these handy dandy little screwdrivers, you can go ahead and install them with one of those, but unfortunately this case doesn't come with one of them. The other option is to install them by hand and then tighten them the last little bit with a pair of pliers or something along those lines. Once all the standoffs are in, carefully position the motherboard over them, but not touching them because you don't want to scratch the back of it. I usually hold the motherboard by the heatsink itself because it gives me something firm to grip onto that won't damage anything. Then, inserting at an angle to ensure that we're not scraping the board across the standoffs as we put it in, we go ahead and put the I/O through the back of the case, then lay it down flat and put in at least one screw right away so that the board's not going to slip anywhere and slide around all over the place. Again, we don't want to damage it. Finally, finish up by installing all 6 of the screws that secure the board in place, and that's pretty much it. Your motherboard is now installed. With the motherboard physically installed, now it's time to install all the wires and cables and connections because this is the point in the build where it's easiest to get at them all. So we're going to start with the 24-pin connector. This is the large, thick connector with, well, 24 pins. It only goes in one way, so if it doesn't seem like it's fitting, turn that baby around and put her in. Followed by the what would normally be 8-pin connector on a high-end board, but this board really doesn't need that much power for the CPU. It's very efficient, so we can break away 4 of the pins and we plug in the 4-pin connector above the CPU socket here. That is followed by the front panel connectors, so this is our power switch, our reset switch, our power LED, and then our drive indicator LED. The power switch and reset switch, the orientation is not important as long as you get them on the correct pins, which are often labeled on the board, but if not, you can check out the motherboard manual that's in the box, whereas the power LED and the drive activity LED, the orientation does matter, so make sure that the colored wires correspond to the positive pins on the motherboard. The last one is the speaker. This one, the orientation is important as well, so same thing, colored wire to positive terminal, and if you get any of those wrong in the first place and the lights or the speaker don't seem to be working, don't worry about it, just flip them around. It's not going to damage anything. Next up, we've got our front USB. This case supports a single front USB 3 connector, but unfortunately our board doesn't, so we weren't able to plug that one in, but it does support front USB 2, so we just want to note where the pin is missing on the connector, where the pin is missing on the header, and then go ahead and plug that in. Front panel audio is installed in much the same way. There's a missing pin in the brick and a missing pin on the board, just like that. You go ahead and plug that in and you're pretty much ready to rock. The last thing now is the fan. So there's a front fan in this case that gives us positive airflow inside, or probably about neutral when you factor in that the power supply is going to be exhausting some air as well, which is lots of airflow as long as we're running integrated graphics or a low-end graphics card. Otherwise, I would recommend installing maybe a rear exhaust fan or something like that. But since we don't have a rear exhaust fan, we're going to use that space right there to manage some of our wires. So because there's no room on the back of the motherboard tray on this case for cable management, we are going to just kind of secure these wires to each other. Most important of all is getting them out of the way of the CPU socket area and the VRM area, which is that area to the left of the socket, so that you don't have any overheating in those areas, and then making sure there's a little bit of clearance between them and the power supply so that there's no interference with the airflow that needs to happen there. And then finally, we're going to do a little bit of, strapping together of these wires at the front to make sure that that front fan has an unobstructed airflow path to the inside of the case. For the hard drives, we need very specific screws, ones that have threads on part of them and then just a straight part that actually goes through the rubber grommets that are pre-installed in the hard drive mounting plate that is positioned vertically in kind of a unique way. So you can either put 2 3.5-inch drives on the rubber mounts, or you can position 3 2.5-inch drives such as SSDs if you space them out correctly and you don't already have a 3.5-inch drive installed. Otherwise, you can do 1 3.5-inch and 1 2.5-inch. It should be noted that there's also a converter up in one of the 5 5.25-inch bays that can support either 3.5 or 2.5-inch drives. Now, one of the things I like about this case is how clever the hard drive mounting system is. Most people buying a $40 case don't need half a dozen hard drives, so it's designed to not only, well, be targeted towards the right people. Yeah, they're probably just going to have a couple drives, but also deliver a great experience for those people by allowing much more airflow over the drives in order to keep them very, very cool compared to most cases in this price bracket, which are just going to have your typical standard hard drive cage in the entire front of the case that really obstructs airflow a lot. So it's a smart design that I quite like. Now, in terms of actually hooking up the drive, once we've screwed it into the plate, we've just got our single 3.5-inch drive. We're going to run a SATA cable directly from the motherboard over to the hard drive. There's not a whole lot of cable management to be done given we've only got one drive. Then we're going to run a SATA power cable from our power supply down to the drive, and then we'll do a little bit of cable management with them to get them mostly out of the way, and that's it. Now, I can't emphasize enough how optional this particular step is. It's more the kind of thing where after you build this system, if you realize it's time for a graphics card, go ahead and do this. So all you got to do to install a graphics card, again, because this case and power supply and motherboard all support this kind of an upgrade, is pull out the top two PCI slot covers by just uninstalling the two thumb screws, then position the graphics card, in this case it's an R7 260X, over the PCI Express slot, that's a 16X slot, push down firmly until it locks into place, then screw the two thumb screws back into place, and finally plug the PCI Express power cable into the back of the card. Now, you will have noted probably that this card only has a single 6-pin PCI Express connector required in order for it to function, but because this 400-watt power supply is a good quality one and comes with two 6+ 2-pin PCI Express connectors, we could actually go ahead and install even much higher-end cards without any difficulty because we have that flexibility that we built into our initial system. With the side panels back in place, our system is pretty much ready to be, well, fired up, but there's still some software stuff that we're going to have to do. So we'll start with BIOS configuration. Go ahead and mash on delete to get into the BIOS, and there's a couple things to double check. So let's make sure that AHCI mode is enabled for our SATA ports, and also ensure that our components are all detected and our memory is running at the correct speed. In this case, we're simulating DDR3 1600 because that's sort of what would fit within our budget. Next up, Windows installation is a snap if you know how. Don't worry about the lack of a disk drive in this machine. Installing off of a USB is as simple as finding a friend with an optical drive, copying all the files directly off your disk onto your USB drive, and then throwing that into the system, booting from it, and you're ready to install. In a simple system like this, there's only one drive to install Windows to, so it's pretty much click, 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 name your PC, click, 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 and you're done. The system will automatically reboot a couple times and you'll be dumped at the desktop. Now, drivers are something that many people struggle with once we're at the Windows desktop, but it's not too overwhelming if you break it down. Even devices that already have drivers installed automatically from Windows Update, I would still recommend checking to make sure you have the latest ones from the manufacturer website. ASRock's website should have the latest AMD chipset drivers, LAN drivers, and sound drivers, but it's never a bad idea to double check by going directly to AMD's site, Realtek's site, or whoever else is the actual manufacturer of the chip, of the component that's on your motherboard. If you're having trouble finding a driver for something, here's a trick that I use. Go to Device Manager, right-click the component in question, then go to Details and use the drop-down box to go to Hardware ID. Google the VEN_number DEV_number string, and it will usually tell you exactly what it is, and often there's a link to where to download the driver. So the conclusion of this video is not so much about the system, but more about the future of the APU on the desktop moving forward, okay? So AMD's made it very clear that APU is sticking around, and the evidence is starting to really increase to indicate that we don't necessarily need the best CPUs to have a great computing experience if we can augment it in other ways. So let's have a look at how our system actually performs. Starting with gaming. In Battlefield 4 at 720p with medium details, it's as advertised. It works, it's playable, and of course we can add our 260X graphics card to it, and all of a sudden it's a great 1080p capable gaming machine, but at least it functions out of the box. Other applications that can take advantage of the GPU that is built onto the CPU, the APU so to speak, are things like WinZip or batch filter processing scripts for Photoshop, for example. These were able to perform much better with the APU using OpenCL acceleration versus just relying on the CPU. All of this sounds particularly awesome and promising when we compare it to other options available in the market, like older PCs that are not able to leverage their GPU compute in order to improve performance, or things like gaming consoles that are a little bit locked down in terms of their functionality. The value of a value PC, I guess we call it value PC, but we don't often think about it that way, is the additional functionality, web browsing, a vast number of supported apps, upgradability, and all the things that we can change about the way we use it in the future. Speaking of the future, AMD's got some pretty exciting things coming for the APU platform, including support for true audio, better graphics, and compute performance with their upcoming Kaveri APUs, and the continuing evolution of the processor technology that's on them towards HSA, which is the equivalent of having your CPU and GPU working together on a Google Doc at the same time to get work done versus them like making revisions to a Word document and then emailing it back and forth to each other, then waiting for replies. I know I actually already talked a little bit about HSA earlier in the video, but they wanted me to use that analogy, but I liked my construction versus rowing one better. So I compromised by putting them both in. Whichever works best for you, let me know in the comments. And until next time, peace out guys, and don't forget to subscribe. Here's some glam footage of our value AMD APU system. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like it if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it. Leave a comment if something compels you to leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. I think I already said that, but I'm just basically buying time here while you guys check out some little glam footage of the system. Yay, and now credits.